Welcome to Front Office Pros. Today, we're going to be going through some Week 10 trade targets.
Hike!
All right, Joe. So, per usual, we each share two. So, who's your first one?
Yeah, first target I'm going to go with is wide receiver A.J. Brown. Coming off a disappointing performance, only 4 targets, 2 catches. Now, he did have bang up his knee during the game, but appears that he's come out of it better than expected. He's just considered day to day, avoided any major knee injury there. So that that helps. That his test came back clean on that, so that alleviates any concern. But if people are worried about AJ Brown's health moving forward, having a disappointing game, leaving early as well. He's already missed 3 games this season, but man, his upcoming schedule is pretty nice. I mean, he's got the Dallas Cowboys, the Commanders, the Rams, Ravens, Panthers, Steelers, Commanders again, and then most people's championship week 17, he's got the Cowboys again. So if there's a chance that you could get him at a slight discount, I think now would be the time. Do you maybe trade a guy like Garrett Wilson, a DK Metcalf, a Puka Nacua, maybe even a guy like CeeDee Lamb without who knows, Dak going on the IR. How much do you trust Cooper Rush to give him that volume that you expect, out of CeeDee Lamb?
So, I guess why him and not Devonta Smith? I saw Devonta Smith had a pretty good game. He's been more healthy than A.J. Brown. I like the schedule. Totally understand your thought process and the idea that because Brown is dinged up and he's been injured this whole year, this could be a window of the Browns owners frustrated. Maybe he doesn't have a good record or and I'm willing to go him. So I see the path. I'm just curious why you elected to go with him instead of Devonta.
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned Devonta Smith before as a nice trade piece, which he had a nice week, and he's had ever since I came up mentioned that he's had a couple of nice weeks here. But I think AJ Brown is still kind of the guy that you want. He's prototypically the one that gets the deep balls, and I think Smith had a good game largely because it was after Brown had left the game that he really started to cook, and he got a couple of deep balls that probably would have went to AJ Brown. Even had a red zone target. I think there's still room in the offense for both to eat, but I still prefer AJ Brown just with his deep threat ability, and Jalen Hurts likes to go deep to him.
So my first trade target is going to be quarterback Aaron Rodgers. Since having Devontae Adams on the team these past 2 weeks, he's done quite well. Ended up having over 200 yards both games, multiple touchdowns. And what I like about it is I think the offense is starting to jive. And I like the schedule ahead. He's got the Cardinals this week, Colts next week, then the bye. He's got Seattle at Miami, which is an okay matchup, but at Jacksonville, Rams. A lot of good matchups ahead. And this is a high-powered offense if they can get themselves right. You got Garrett Wilson, you got Devontae Adams now. So to me, I like the matchups going forward for Aaron Rodgers. I think you could do a lot worse. And honestly, you wouldn't have to trade that much for him. His value is pretty low right now. On the Draft Sharks trade value chart here, he's at a 9. So, I mean, you're talking about the equivalent of, Tyjae Spears or Michael Wilson or Elijah Moore or Xavier Legette. I think you probably have to trade a little bit more. It depends on how teams value quarterbacks in your league. Obviously, in a super flex league, he's going to be much more valuable. Still, I would be willing to go and acquire him in a super flex league. I just really like the matchups ahead. I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and to your point, did that week against the Texans, did they finally figure something out? The Jets offense looked a little bit better. I mean, him and Devontae Adams showed off that connection. It had looked a little rusty, the first couple of weeks there. Just wondering, after they get the big win on Halloween night, do they continue to roll from here and maybe go on a run? And Rodgers, I think the bleeding that they played on a Thursday night as well, this extra rest should help him kind of heal up the ankle injury or whatever other ailments he might have been dealing with as well.
Not to mention, I just think his back is up against the wall. The teams is, they're trying to make the playoffs. I think they're going to be aggressive, and the running game hasn't been as effective as we thought that it would be. With Brees Hall, especially, carrying most of the load. So I like Aaron Rodgers' matchups going forward. Are you enjoying this episode so far? Well, if you are, subscribe to our YouTube channel, smash that like button, and hit the notification bell for upcoming videos. We do videos throughout the year, so you're not going to want to miss what we have in store. All right, Joe. So going on to your next trade target, who is it?
Yeah, I'm going to stay at the wide receiver position, and I'm going to go with Brian Thomas Jr. Currently being valued on the Draft Sharks value here at 48. I think now could be an interesting time to go get him. As he played with that going in questionable with a chest injury. He played. I feel like they tried almost not to utilize him. He only had 4 targets, 2 catches. He's really only had a couple of disappointing games. Last week just happened to be one of them. But I think a week healthier, from that chest injury, I think we could see him get back to his normal utilization. And, honestly, he's also had a, touchdown 5 of the 9 weeks as well, which is pretty good. And his red zone targets are still there. He still had a red zone target against the Eagles as well, just didn't come up with a touchdown, or else he wouldn't have been as disappointing. But he's got some decent matchups. I mean, Minnesota this upcoming week, but at Detroit, then a bye week, but then Houston, Tennessee, Jets, and Vegas and Tennessee as well. I just think he's the type of guy that he's got that ceiling that if you get him now, he could potentially just help you add to take your team over the top.
Are you concerned at all just the connection that Trevor Lawrence has with Evan Ingram? You kind of saw that even most in this past week, how much volume Evan Ingram got. Obviously, when we look back at last year, he did really well. Obviously, Christian Kirk no longer being there out for the year certainly could help from a target volume perspective for Brian Thomas. But does that concern you at all with Evan Ingram?
Somewhat. I mean, they've showed off their connection, but I think a lot of that has to do with really a lot of that happened after the Kirk injury, but then also, Brian Thomas Jr. getting dinged up. You saw him go into Evan Ingram more as well. But before he got dinged up, Brian Thomas was like a focal point of the offense. He was getting the deep targets, really taking advantage of those big plays down the field. So, I mean, he's got a decent ceiling. And like I said, he usually gets a touchdown as well. And even with the injury, he still was getting those red zone targets.
Would you rather have Hopkins or Brian Thomas?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I think it could be a decent time to sell high on Hopkins in that big game. We've seen Chiefs receivers have big games before and then kind of disappear. Now Hopkins does seem to have a pretty good role in the Chiefs offense, but let's be honest, they were also facing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and it's a great secondary to face. So it's not surprising that he had a big game against the Buccaneers, but it's just can he, continue to sustain it? They've got some tougher matchups upcoming as the Chiefs do. So I almost might want to just sell high on that performance if I'm a Hopkins owner.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about actually the idea of possibly trading away Hopkins for this guy, which is going to be wide receiver Jayden Reed. I don't have him, but I'm just saying I could see myself if I had Hopkins trading for him. Really love his matchups down the stretch, especially during that playoff stretch at Detroit, at Seattle, New Orleans, and at Minnesota. Came better than that. And the Packers are going to be, competing for probably the division at that point. It's definitely not a wild card. I think Reed, there's an opportunity there. Before this past week, he's been kind of in a dry spell these past 2 games. So he was considered a wide receiver 1 on the year. So he did have 6 targets, 5 catches for 113 yards this past week against the Lions. So I like Reed a lot. I don't think he's not the most flashy name, but I think you could probably acquire him. Because also with the Jordan Love injury, that is a concern too. He's not going to be as good probably with Malik Willis under center, but it seems like Love is okay enough that he's going to keep it a go. So I think if you trade Jayden Reed or for him, I think it makes sense. Maybe you trade a guy like James Conner, Tony Pollard, something like that. Hopkins I talked about could all be some options.
Yeah, I definitely think it's an interesting option, and I think this week's a good week as well, just because he's also on happens to be on a bye week. I mean, also gives another week where Love isn't playing, gives him an extra week to heal up for to kind of alleviate those concerns. But if a team's not doing too well and really needs to win their matchup and needs a player that can perform, acquiring a guy in a bye week can really be a good time to do that.
So that does it for this episode. We talked about a few trade targets that we got our eyes on. So make sure you reach out to those owners and start having those conversations because, Joe, the trade deadline's going to probably be here before we know it. So if you're going to get a deal done, you better get it done soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw the actual NFL deadline come and go here. Fair amount of deals. Would have liked to see a little more action, but hopefully there's more action in your actual leagues.
Yeah, nothing too crazy. No big names that went off the table, but that's okay. Your trade deadline and your leagues may be more eventful, so hopefully that happens for you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time.